This video compiles material from 3 individual tapes, each meticulously numbered and dated. These appear to be the initial entries in my grandfather's archival endeavor. As I listened for the first time, I felt a bit perplexed. It seems my grandpa was collecting first-hand accounts of mysterious or paranormal occurrences. While I've never been a believer in the supernatural or eerie, my grandfather clearly deemed these recordings significant. Please take the time to listen and share your thoughts in the comments section. Your insights could be very illuminating.
The story I'm about to share comes from Private Alan Baker, a seasoned veteran of the British Royal Army who served in both World Wars. I had the fortune of meeting Alan during his vacation in New York, and he shared with me a tale that defies explanation. Imagine the claustrophobia and tension of standing in a narrow, muddy trench for endless hours, awaiting a whistle that could send you into a hellfire of bullets and explosions. This was the grim reality of the Great War's second year, a conflict that had already claimed countless lives, including those of my childhood friends, slaughtered by machine guns, crushed under cavalry hooves, or shattered by artillery fire. During the March to the Sea, a critical operation aimed at sealing off the German army, my unit was tasked with holding several makeshift trenches along the border. These trenches were infamous for their poor construction and lack of stability. We were informed that we'd be there for a few days, our primary role being to thwart any German advances. This also meant countless hours of peering across the dreaded no-man's land, a wasteland separating us from the enemy trenches. On the first night, my comrades and I were vigilant, our eyes trained down our rifle sights for any sign of German activity. Suddenly, Cecil Waters, a close friend, sprang up as if bitten by a snake, accusing someone of breathing down his neck. We all laughed, dismissing it as a nervous tic or perhaps a prank. However, hours later, a similar incident occurred with Bryant Perkins, another friend. He too complained about someone breathing on his neck. We chuckled again, as pranks and banter were often our only relief from the grim reality of war. But our laughter turned to horror when young John Apple was so spooked that he dashed out of the trench, ignoring our desperate calls for him to return. A single gunshot echoed and he collapsed back into the trench, his face frozen in terror. Over the next day, similar complaints spread like wildfire among the troops. Morale plummeted as suspicion grew, but we could never pinpoint a prankster, if one even existed. On our last night in that trench, I was on watch duty. The air was filled with the distant thunder of artillery, and the night was as dark as coal. That's when I felt it, a faint, warm breath on the back of my neck. I was the sole sentry at that moment, making the presence behind me not just impossible, but unsettlingly otherworldly. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, until the sensation finally ceased. Remarkably, after we were relocated, no one experienced the eerie breathing again. It was an enigma that receded into the back of my mind as the war's horrors escalated. Years later, during a vacation in France, I met a German veteran. Through our fractured conversation, we realized we had been enemies in the same battle. In hushed tones, he posed a question that sent chills down my spine. Did you also feel the breath on your neck? What was it that haunted those trenches? Was it something meant to frighten us, or perhaps even something more sinister? I can't say for sure. All I know is those trenches still scar the French landscape. I have no intention of revisiting them, and I suggest you stay away as well. The testimony you're about to read comes from Lieutenant Stephen Ambrose, a seasoned soldier in the United States Army during World War II. His account has been verified by multiple soldiers of lower ranks who were under his command, though military higher-ups have dismissed the story as war-induced hallucination or perhaps even fabrication. But the men who were there, including myself, know otherwise. This is Lieutenant Ambrose's haunting account. When I received orders to ship out to Europe, I was raring to go, filled with youthful bravado and patriotic fervor. Back home, signing up for duty was almost a rite of passage. The spirit was contagious. But upon landing in France, the grim reality of war was quick to shatter any romantic notions we'd carried across the Atlantic. Despite assurances from higher command that the Reich was on its knees, we found an enemy still formidable and ruthless. I was responsible for a small, tight-knit platoon, our main objective being the liberation and securement of towns from German control. This often meant grim, vicious, house-to-house fighting. The nature of this work took a toll. Good men I'd come to call friends were lost in this nightmarish slog. On one fateful day, I received orders to liberate a French town identified as Cadleu. Perplexed, I consulted my military maps, finding no such place. My superiors seemed unconcerned, providing directional guidance and stressing the importance of the mission. Upon arrival, it became evident that Cadleu did indeed exist. A welcome sign etched in faded paint confirmed it. Yet, an eerie stillness enveloped the town. No civilians greeted us, no rogue German soldiers fired at us. Even the stray dogs one might expect in war-torn regions were conspicuously absent. Following my gut instincts, I instructed the platoon to hold position while a scouting team thoroughly investigated the unsettling silence. When the all-clear was eventually given, my men commenced a house-to-house search. I briefed them to exercise extreme caution and to immediately report any discoveries. The first house we entered presented a tableau of horror that haunts me to this day. A family of 4, a mother, father, and 2 young children, were seated around a meticulously set dining table. Each plate bore food, as if in anticipation of a meal. Strangely, the house appeared untouched by the war that had decimated so many others. What was profoundly unsettling was the state of the family members. Each one was gaunt to the point of emaciation, their flesh clinging to their bones, eyes sunken into hollow sockets. It was as if they had been starved to death, held captive by the very seats they occupied. Yet, confounding all reason, the food on their plates was inexplicably warm, as if freshly cooked. I immediately commanded my men to refrain from touching anything and to continue their search. The rest of the houses yielded identical scenes. Lifeless residents, all emaciated, seated at dinner tables with warm meals in front of them. In total, we found between 100 to 200 such victims. When we reported back, military brass ordered a more extensive investigation. Yet, the town of Cadleu seemed to have vanished off the face of the earth. No one could locate it. My superiors suggested I lead another mission to find it, but I flatly refused. I would not subject my men to that unspeakable horror a second time. To this day, the official stance is that our collective experience was nothing more than war hysteria, but those who walked the ghostly streets of Cadleu, who stared into the hollow eyes of its dead residents, know better, and so do I. The following story comes from a Private Lyle Steele. I met Lyle during a brief stop-off in the small town of Cooperstown. He has graciously allowed me to write this report down. I made sure to thank him for his service. The following is his words. I was a young soldier back then, part of a unit sent to secure a small French village, recently liberated from German occupation. The place was in ruins, half destroyed by the war and eerily empty. Most of its inhabitants had either fled or died, leaving behind a haunting, silent tableau. We set up camp near an old chapel that stood relatively unscathed amidst the devastation. Something about that chapel unsettled me from the moment I saw it. The building was ancient, adorned with grotesque gargoyles and unsettling frescoes that seemed out of place for a house of God. It emanated a palpable sense of wrongness, for lack of a better word. It was a couple of days later that we began to hear the singing, soft, haunting melodies drifting through the night air, coming from the direction of the chapel. The strangest part, the songs were in Latin, an archaic form that none of us could decipher. Intrigued and unsettled, some of the men wanted to investigate, but our commanding officer forbade it. "We have orders, and ghost hunting isn't among them," he said. However, curiosity got the better of me. One night, I took it upon myself to explore the chapel. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and my service pistol, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was musty with the scent of old books and candle wax, layered with something else I couldn't quite place, a metallic, almost electric smell. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room. It was empty, devoid of life. But then I saw it, an old, dusty book lying open on the pulpit, its pages filled with unfamiliar symbols and sketches of disturbing, nightmarish creatures. The moment I laid eyes on that book, the singing resumed. It was louder now, resonating through the very walls of the chapel, as if the building itself was alive. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I moved closer to the book. The Latin text seemed to shift and change as I tried to read it, morphing into legible English for just a moment. "To summon is to bind, to listen is to answer," it read, before blurring back into indecipherable Latin characters. That's when I felt it, a chilling gust of wind, as if an unseen door had been opened. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panicked, I fumbled for my pistol, but before I could draw it, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from behind the pulpit. I held my breath, waiting for whatever horror I had unleashed to reveal itself. The footsteps stopped just in front of me, close enough that I could hear ragged, shallow breathing. I smelled the electric tang of ozone, mixed with something fetid and ancient. Then, a whisper, so soft it was almost drowned out by my own heartbeat. "Libertas." Freedom. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, echoing in the walls of the chapel. I don't remember running out of that place, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was back in camp, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. I never spoke of what happened that night, not even when other members of my unit reported hearing the same haunting melodies, always emanating from the direction of the chapel. We left the village a few days later, but the memory of that eerie chapel has never left me. Whatever I encountered that night, whatever that book was, I'm convinced it was older and darker than the war that ragged around us. I had a feeling then, and still do now, that some thresholds are best left uncrossed, and that some songs, no matter how hauntingly beautiful, are not meant for mortal ears.